Here's what Lula said on February 18th. This is an excerpt from a Reuters report, and he's speaking in Portuguese, which is the language of Brazil, but the English translation is provided on the subtitles by Reuters on the screen. This is Lula on February 18th. This is what has sparked one of the most intense and rapidly unfolding diplomatic conflict between two major countries that we have seen in quite some time. Here's what Lula said.
Do que está acontecendo na faixa de Gaza com o povo palestino, não existe nenhum outro momento histórico. Aliás, existiu quando Hitler resolveu matar os judeus. É muito engraçado. É muito engraçado. Quando eu vejo o mundo rico anunciar que está parando de dar contribuição para a questão humanitária aos palestinos, eu fico imaginando qual é o tamanho da consciência política dessa gente e qual é o tamanho do coração solidário dessa gente, que não está vendo que na faixa de Gaza não está acontecendo uma guerra, mas um genocídio. De que não é uma guerra entre soldados e soldados, é uma guerra entre um exército altamente preparado e mulheres e crianças.
So that was a speech that caused so much uproar by the Israeli government. And I guess we should add, before we get into the substance, that that last statement, the last part of that statement, namely that Gaza has no trained army. They have no air force. They cannot fly. They have no real military of any kind. They're not a state. It's not really a war. It's not a war between two armies like the way, say, it is in Ukraine and Russia. It's a attack by one of the world's most sophisticated militaries, financed and backed by the most powerful government on the planet, which is the United States, providing it all the arms it wants and all the weapons and bombs that it uses and all the money that it needs to attack one of the most densely packed populations on the planet filled with civilians. It's a population of 2.2 million people in Gaza, 50% of whom are children. 50% are under the age of 18. You add into that women, and that constitutes 75% of the population. And then innocent men, you're up to 80, 85% of the population at least. And yet you have just a complete massacre for 5 months now. Here from the New York Times, February 19th, it describes or summarizes the results from Lula's speech. Here's the headline: Brazil's president angers Israel after comparing war in Gaza to the Holocaust. Israel said it had asked for a meeting with the Brazilian ambassador. Quote, Mr. Lula's statement outraged Israeli officials. The Israeli foreign minister, Israel Katz, said in a statement on social media in Hebrew that the remarks were, quote, shameful and egregious. He said that Brazil's ambassador will be called into his office on Monday for a, quote, reprimand, adding that no one will harm Israel's right to defend itself. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel echoed those sentiments in his own social media post. Mr. Netanyahu accused Brazil's president of, quote, trivializing the Holocaust and trying to harm the Jewish people and Israel's right to defend itself, and said that, quote, comparing Israel to the Nazi Holocaust and Hitler is crossing a red line. I just want you to remember that. Netanyahu said that comparing Israel to the Nazi Holocaust and Hitler is crossing a red line, even though, as we just saw, Israel frequently, as does the United States, compares its enemies to Nazis, to Hitler. Countries in the world can freely be compared to Adolf Hitler, to Nazis. The Holocaust can continuously be invoked by the West and its allies to accuse other governments or regimes of being barbaric and savage. But invoking that argument or that historical lesson when talking about Israel, says Benjamin Netanyahu, representing, I think, a significant bulk of opinion in the West, is, quote, crossing a red line. In other words, you're free to use that example for almost every other country, but not Israel. Israel is exempt from any lessons that you might want to derive from the Holocaust. Quote, Mr. Netanyahu added in a separate statement that Mr. Lula has, quote, disgraced the memory of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and demonized the Jewish state like the most virulent anti-Semite. I just want to ask for 1 second. I just showed you Lula's quote. And as I said, the speech itself was much more nuanced. It was vehemently denouncing Hamas and the attack on October 7th and the use of sexual violence and threats of it, he said, and the attacks on civilians that were inexcusable and indefensible, and the use of hostages. He talked about all of that. But even if he didn't, even if he had only said the part that we showed you, the part that's circulating on social media, in what conceivable way could that be anti-Semitism? He's criticizing the actions of a state, of a government, of political leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet, the people running this war. He's criticizing them for insufficient concern for the lives of civilians. In what conceivable way is that an argument that is expressing animosity toward Jews generally? Obviously, we know what this is. This is the attempt that Israel always uses, and its supporters here in the United States, to accuse anybody who criticizes Israel of being anti-Semitic. They have conflated the Israeli government with Jews generally, even though, especially in this war, the war in Gaza, so many prominent Jews and ordinary Jews around the world have been among the leaders, the most vocal opponents of the war in Gaza, to claim that somehow criticizing the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu as an attack on all Jews is exactly the tactic that Israel supporters complain about when done by the left or by American liberals, namely calling everybody racist or xenophobic or transphobic or whatever to stifle debate and destroy people's reputations. It's exactly the same thing. Now, in case that wasn't enough, here's what the official Twitter account of Israel said today. Here was a playful little tweet about Brazil and the Brazilian flag posted by this account, World of Statistics. And they asked, what comes to mind when you think of Brazil? And the state of Israel, the official Israeli account, took this tweet and above it wrote, quote, before or after Lula went full-on Holocaust denier. This is insanely dishonest, if not stupid. What Lula was saying was that we don't have a historical precedent for what is being done in Gaza, the level of civilian destruction, the disregard for human life, unless you go back to the Holocaust, when the Germans tried to murder all Jews. Now, you may not agree with what Lula said in that comparison. You may think it's overboard, but in no conceivable way is it Holocaust denialism. It's, in fact, the opposite. It's using the Holocaust and the evils of it and drawing lessons from it about how human beings can be dehumanized in order to condemn what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Now, again, whatever that is, it is not anti-Semitism and is not Holocaust denialism. Not in any conceivable way. Now, one of the reasons that the Israelis acted so emotionally, so full of rage, is because the reality is that Brazil is a large and important country. It's the 6th largest country in the world by population. It's the largest country in South America. It has very important oil reserves and environmental resources. It's the world's 10th largest economy. And Lula, for better or for worse, you may hate him or not, but the reality is that he is a very credible figure on the world stage. He's not Nicolas Maduro. He's not some leader of a small African country that has no respect. Brazil's diplomatic corps is regarded as being among the best, if not the best in the world. Brazil has always been able to maintain a significant presence on the world stage, and especially when Lula was president from 2002 to 2010, Brazil worked a lot to build an independent profile, independent of the United States and of other blocs, and was effective in negotiating all sorts of diplomatic arrangements, including attempting with Turkey to solve the crisis that had arisen during the Obama administration between Iran and the United States by negotiating a deal between Iran and the United States to try and resolve that crisis. And so for someone like Lula to come out and say something like this is a huge deal for Israel. And already you're seeing the effects here from the city paper of Bogota, which is the paper in the capital of Colombia. You may recall last week when I was traveling, we interviewed the top advisor to President Petro, the newly elected president of Colombia, elected in 2022. We interviewed Gustavo Bolivar, who's his closest advisor. We talked to him about all sorts of issues involving Colombia, the region, the fight against the drug war, but also Colombia's condemnation of Israel in Gaza and why Colombia felt compelled to do that. And the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, came out, quote, in complete solidarity with Lula today on Gaza, escalating tensions again with Israel. Quote, Colombian President Gustavo Petro made it very clear on his social media platform, X, that Brazil's Lula Inácio Lula da Silva had, quote, spoken the truth when he mentioned that there is a, quote, genocide in Gaza and thereby deserves his complete solidarity. In this most recent statement to 7.5 million followers regarding the Israel-Hamas war, Petro underscored that, quote, thousands of children, women, and elderly civilians are being cowardly murdered and that truth must be, quote, defended or barbarism will annihilate us. Petro called on, quote, the entire region to unite immediately to end the violence in Palestine and emphasized that the ruling of the International Court of Justice on Israel, quote, must generate application and consequence in the diplomatic relations of all countries in the world. Now, all of this invokes a very important debate about who is the owner of the discourse about the Holocaust? Who gets to dictate how the lessons of the Holocaust, the lessons of Nazism, the lessons of World War II get applied? Remember, the state of Israel didn't even exist at the time that Nazi Germany was defeated and the camps in the concentration camps liberated. That was done by the United States and the UK and Russia, the Soviet Union, the Allied powers. They lost many, many lives in order to do that. And you can say the lessons of the Holocaust belongs to Jews who were the primary victim of it, but not the only victim. But 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, obviously a gigantic event in the history of international Jewry. But it's also a lesson for all of humanity and for the countries that fought wars in order to battle against Nazism. And oftentimes the people who are invoking the Holocaust in order to condemn the actions of Israelis and specifically the treatment of Jews are some of the leading Jewish intellectuals on the planet. And that isn't only the case now, it's been the case almost since the creation of the State of Israel. Earlier this week, the Polk Awards were announced. They're the second most prestigious awards for journalism after the Pulitzers. And a Polk Award was given for essays to the American Russian Jewish writer Masha Gessen, who is a writer for The New Yorker. And on December 9th of 2023, Gessen wrote an article entitled In the Shadow of the Holocaust, where essentially the discussion was that Gessen had gone through all sorts of sites in Germany and in Europe looking at Holocaust monuments and came to realize that especially in Germany, especially in Europe, the Holocaust has to become this shield, this weapon to immunize Israel from criticism. When in fact, the lessons of the Holocaust were seen almost from the end of World War II as something far more universal than that. And this was the subheadline, quote, how the politics of memory in Europe obscures what we see in Israel and Gaza today. And this is a really interesting incident recalled by Gessen. And for this essay, Masha Gessen had an event to speak in Germany, and that event was canceled after Germans complained that this article was anti-Semitic, even though Gessen is a Jew, a born Jew, and was speaking for a lot of Jewish critics of Israel. And one of the things Gessen recalled was a historical event involving the Jewish German philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wrote essays reflecting on the Holocaust. She went to the Nuremberg trials. She observed Adolf Eichmann on the stand and coined the phrase, the banality of evil. She was shocked that these Nazis who were being tried at the Nuremberg trials were not these monsters breathing fire. A lot of them just seemed like banal accountants carrying out their duties and their orders, and she described that as the banality of evil. That it's not often the crazed psychopaths who engage in the worst conduct, but oftentimes just the good, decent man doing what he's told, adhering to societal norms. And this essay recalled the following, quote, in 1948, the year Israel was created and founded, 3 years after World War II ended, Hannah Arendt wrote an open letter that began, quote, among the most disturbing political phenomena of our times is the emergence in the newly created state of Israel of the, quote, Freedom Party, a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties, end quote. Gessen then wrote, quote, just 3 years after the Holocaust, Arendt was comparing a Jewish Israeli party to the Nazi party, an act that today would be a clear violation of the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, which is the piece of legislation that has been enacted in Europe to criminalize as anti-Semitism certain types of criticism of the state of Israel. So here you have one of the most prominent Jewish philosophers and writers of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, invoking the Holocaust to condemn far-right nationalists in Israel during the formation of the state of Israel for using Nazi rhetoric and Nazi tactics and a Nazi mindset toward Arabs that was redolent of what she saw at the Nuremberg trials. There was never any sense that Israel or Israelis or Jews were somehow off limits to having the lessons of the Holocaust applied to them, the way that Benjamin Netanyahu tries today to insist Israel is immune and that only anti-Semites would do. And then Gessen talked about the trial of, Arendt was talking about the trial of Adolf Eichmann and wrote the following, quote, here was the devil himself. The prosecution argued that Eichmann represented but one iteration of the eternal threat to the Jews. The trial helped to solidify the narrative that to prevent annihilation, Jews should be prepared to use force preemptively. Arendt, reporting on the trial, would have none of this. Her phrase, quote, the banality of evil, elicited perhaps the original accusations leveled against a Jew of trivializing the Holocaust, but she wasn't. But she saw that Eichmann was no devil, that perhaps the devil didn't exist. She had reasoned that there was no such thing as radical evil, that evil was always ordinary, even when it was extreme, something, quote, born in the gutter, as she put it later, something of utter shallowness. Arendt took issue with the persecution story that the Jews were the victims of, as she put it, a historical principle stretching from Pharaoh to Haman, the victim of a metaphysical principle. In other words, the lesson of the Holocaust was not that Germans are uniquely evil, nor that Jews are uniquely vulnerable to atrocities being committed against them. The lessons of the Holocaust was that human nature, being human nature, can lead groups of people, if they feel sufficiently threatened or scared or persuaded by their tribe, to hate another group of people so much that they dehumanize them to the point that they have no trouble treating them like subhumans, like just extinguishing their lives without value. And that the lessons of the Holocaust were universal and humanitarian and not about one group of people victimizing another. And it wasn't just Hannah Arendt who emphasized the universality of the lessons of the Holocaust. It was also the judges and the prosecutors of the Nuremberg trial. The Nuremberg trial was an incredible event. The Americans, when they defeated Nazi Germany with the immense help of the Soviet Union, captured a lot of Nazi war criminals, and they could have just executed them all on the spot. That's often what was done in war. But they decided instead to hold a trial that the world could watch, in part so that these inevitable executions would have a legal justification to them. I mean, these were not fair courts. They were going to result in convictions. This was a form of victor's justice, but still putting a legal process on it elevated it and made it more civilized, unlike, say, the way that the United States decided to kill instead of capture and try Osama bin Laden. The Americans, after World War II, decided to capture and try the Nazi war criminals who were responsible for the Holocaust. But they also did it because they wanted to present the evidence of the Holocaust to the world, knowing that otherwise there'd be a lot of people who denied the Holocaust, who doubted the Holocaust. Of course, to this day, there still are people who doubt it despite the abundance of evidence offered at this trial and elsewhere proving it. But what they really wanted to do, above all else, was to create universal principles going forward that applied to all countries, not just to Germany, that would govern and limit their conduct in future wars, because what they had seen from World War II was not that Germans were capable of evil, but that human beings were. And they constantly emphasized, the Nuremberg trial judges and prosecutors did, that the Nuremberg trial would only be valid, would only make sense, would only have purpose and value if the principles it established applied to every nation going forward. Here is what the lead prosecutor, the American lawyer Robert Jackson, he had previously served in the U.S. Justice Department and became the lead prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, said in his opening statement, quote, "What makes this inquest significant is that these prisoners, these Nazis, represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatreds, of terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. They are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarisms. And let me make clear that while this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment. We are able to do away with domestic tyranny and violence and aggression by those in power against the rights of their people only when we make all men answerable to the law. This trial represents mankind's desperate effort to apply the discipline of the law to statesmen who have used their powers of state to attack the foundations of the world's peace and to commit aggressions against the rights of their neighbors." Does any of that sound like Israel was intended to be immunized or excluded from lessons being drawn about the Holocaust, or that somehow a state of the Jews was somehow immune from the worst temptations of human nature? The exact opposite was true. They repeated that over and over. And so you can dispute whether or not this comparison is appropriate on the facts, but to claim that any invocation of the Holocaust as a way of criticizing the government of Israel's behavior is inherently inappropriate or anti-Semitic or Holocaust denialism is deceit of the highest order.